Spiritual awakening isn't beautiful at first, it's brutal. Everyone talks about light and higher consciousness, but no one warns you that awakening begins in darkness. It's not meditation under the stars. It's crying on the floor, wondering why everything you once believed suddenly feels like a lie. When your soul begins to wake, your old life starts to crumble. The people, the habits, the dreams, all the illusions that once made you feel safe begin to collapse. And that collapse feels like death. But what's really dying is the false self, the mask that kept you asleep. Most people never survive their awakening because they mistake the breakdown for the end, when it's really the beginning. They run from the fire instead of walking through it. But the chosen, they endure. They understand that awakening isn't about becoming new. It's about burning everything that isn't true. And when the smoke clears, they rise, clearer, calmer, and unstoppable. Subscribe to join the Guru Clan, a brotherhood of awakened warriors walking through the fire of transformation. Comment below. What was the hardest part of your awakening? 1. Because awakening feels like death before rebirth. Every spiritual awakening begins with death. Not the kind that ends your heartbeat, the kind that ends your illusions. It's the death of who you thought you were, who you pretended to be, and who the world convinced you to become. And make no mistake, that kind of death hurts more than any physical pain. When the awakening begins, it doesn't arrive as peace. It arrives as chaos. Your soul starts tearing down everything inside you that isn't real. The relationships built on lies. The beliefs rooted in fear. The ambitions fed by ego. They all start to crumble. What you once called life starts slipping through your fingers, and you stand in the ashes wondering what's left. Most people can't survive that stage because it feels like destruction, and it is. Awakening is a demolition before it's a construction. The false self has to burn so the true self can breathe, and that burning feels like death. You start questioning everything: your purpose, your worth, your sanity. The things that once gave you comfort now feel empty. The people who once understood you now look at you like a stranger. That's the moment most people turn back. They run from the fire, searching for something familiar to numb the pain. They go back to distractions, back to comfort, back to sleep, because awakening isn't what they imagined. They thought it would be light. Instead, it's loss. They thought it would be clarity. Instead, it's confusion. But that's the paradox. The light doesn't arrive until the darkness finishes its work. The truth is, awakening has to destroy you before it can rebuild you. Because the person you were before, the ego, the mask, the identity, cannot survive higher consciousness. That version of you was created by fear, validation, and control. Awakening kills that version so your soul can finally lead. But death, even spiritual death, is terrifying. It strips away your attachments, your sense of control, and your old sources of happiness. You feel naked before existence, powerless and exposed. You realize how fragile your old sense of self was. And in that emptiness, you're forced to face the one thing you've avoided your entire life: yourself. That's why it feels like death, because it's the death of separation, the death of illusion, the death of comfort. But it's also the beginning of truth. The chosen endure this phase because something in them refuses to run. They let the fire burn. They let the walls collapse. They surrender to the death of who they were. even when it breaks them, because deep down they know something sacred is trying to emerge. That something is the real you, the one that doesn't chase validation, the one that doesn't live through fear, the one that doesn't need the world's approval to feel alive. But that version can only rise from ashes. Awakening isn't pretty. It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to dismantle every illusion that has ever kept you small. It strips you of fake confidence, false beliefs, and shallow attachments until all that remains is what's eternal. And when you reach that point, when there's nothing left to cling to, and you think you've lost everything, you begin to feel something new. Stillness, clarity, presence, peace, not built on external things, but born from within. That's the rebirth, the resurrection of consciousness after the ego's funeral. It's not loud, it's not dramatic. It's quiet, deep, and pure. It's the moment you realize you never needed saving, only shedding. Most people never reach that moment because they fear the death too much to meet the rebirth. They resist, they cling, they hide. But the chosen, they endure. They walk through the fire until only truth remains. Because spiritual awakening isn't about finding light. It's about surviving the darkness long enough to become it. 2. Because truth destroys comfort. Truth is not gentle, it's surgical. It doesn't soothe you at first, it cuts. Awakening isn't a sunrise, it's lightning. It rips through everything false, leaving nothing untouched. The moment truth enters your life, comfort begins to die. When you start to awaken, the first thing you notice is how much of your life was built on illusion. The people you trusted, the systems you obeyed, the beliefs you worshipped. You start seeing how much of what you called normal was really manipulation. How much of what you called success was really slavery. Truth doesn't politely reveal itself. It exposes, confronts, and shatters. And that's why most people can't survive awakening, because the truth doesn't heal first. It hurts first. It destroys before it delivers. It shows you the rot underneath the surface of comfort. And that's more than most can bear. When you see how much of your life was lived on autopilot, chasing validation, living through screens, following rules that never made sense, you start to realize that awakening isn't what you wanted. It's what your soul needed. You didn't ask for the pain, but the pain was the only thing strong enough to wake you up. The truth reveals that comfort was never peace. It was sedation. The world trains you to fear discomfort because comfort keeps you controlled. You obey because you don't want to lose the illusion of stability. But awakening strips that illusion bare. It shows you that everything you thought you owned, everything you thought you were, everything you thought was safe, was temporary, fragile, and false. That realization burns. It makes you question everything, your relationships, your career, even your identity. The friends you once shared jokes with now feel shallow. The goals that once drove you now feel meaningless. You start to feel isolated, misunderstood, alien, not because the world changed, but because you finally see it. And that's when most people turn back. They retreat into comfort, back to distractions, addictions, and noise, because the silence of truth is too loud. They confuse familiarity with safety, and they choose the known prison over the unknown freedom. It's easier to believe the lie than to rebuild your life around the truth. But the chosen can't go back. Once you've seen, you cannot unsee. Once you've tasted truth, illusion loses its flavor. Comfort begins to suffocate. So you keep walking, barefoot through the shards of your old world, bleeding but awake. You start to realize that truth doesn't destroy your life. It destroys what was never truly living. It kills the false self, the fake stability, the borrowed beliefs. It tears down the walls that kept you small, even if those walls once made you feel safe. This destruction is not cruelty, it's liberation. It's the soul performing surgery on itself. It removes the infection called illusion so that real life can grow. And like any healing, it hurts before it helps. The chosen endure this stage with quiet strength. They learn to sit in the discomfort without running, to breathe through the collapse without begging for rescue, because they understand something most never will, that comfort is the death of growth, and truth is the birth of freedom. You cannot awaken and stay comfortable. One must die for the other to live. That's the paradox. The truth strips away your illusions so violently that you're left exposed, raw, and uncertain. But in that emptiness, something sacred is born. Clarity, integrity, vision, freedom. And once you taste that freedom, no matter how lonely, how uncertain, how uncomfortable, you realize it's worth more than the entire world built on lies. That's why most never make it. They want enlightenment, but they don't want exposure. They want peace, but they don't want to lose their comfort. But the chosen, they choose truth over numbness. They let the lie burn, and they rise from its ashes awake. 3. Because isolation breaks the weak, every true awakening eventually leads to silence. Not the gentle silence of peace, but the heavy, echoing silence of separation. The kind that strips you of every distraction, every comfort, and every familiar voice. It's the stage no one prepares you for, the moment when awakening pulls you away from everything and everyone, leaving you face to face with nothing but yourself. At first, it feels like abandonment. People you once laughed with suddenly feel distant. Conversations that once energized you now feel meaningless. You try to reconnect, to fit back into your old world, but something inside you has shifted too far. You've outgrown the noise. You no longer vibrate on the same frequency, and that's when the loneliness hits. The real kind. Not the loneliness of being without people, but the loneliness of being without illusion. It's a spiritual isolation, a sacred exile. The universe pulls you away not to punish you, but to prepare you, because the truth is you cannot awaken surrounded by noise. The soul's transformation requires stillness, but most people can't handle that stillness. They mistake it for emptiness. They run back to company, back to distraction, back to the comfort of familiar conversations and shallow validation. They can't bear the silence because in silence, the truth gets loud. Their thoughts, their fears, their unhealed wounds all begin to speak, and the ego panics. That's why isolation breaks the weak, because silence exposes everything the noise was hiding. Without the world to project onto, you're forced to face yourself. Every shadow, every insecurity, every unresolved emotion, they all rise to the surface. There's nowhere to hide. The masks that worked in crowds no longer work in solitude. For most, that's too much. They crave comfort more than clarity, so they flee. But the chosen stay. They sit in the silence until it no longer scares them. They learn to befriend the stillness, to hear its language. They start realizing that isolation isn't a void, it's a classroom. Every moment alone becomes a lesson in strength, patience, and self-mastery. You begin to understand that solitude is not punishment, it's purification. The universe separates you so you can shed attachments that were never real. It removes the noise so you can finally hear your own voice. It empties your hands of false connections so that when true alignment comes, you'll recognize it instantly. The chosen who endure isolation undergo a metamorphosis. Their mind sharpens, their spirit deepens, their emotions stabilize. They no longer seek company out of fear, but out of resonance. They stop chasing people who drain their energy because solitude has taught them peace is more valuable than attention. It's in this silence that the awakened begin to see clearly. They start hearing divine whispers, intuitive guidance, and the voice of their higher self. They realize that the solitude that once felt like exile is actually initiation, a sacred passage between who they were and who they are becoming. You start to love the silence that once terrified you. You find peace in your own company. You stop fearing aloneness because you discover that solitude and loneliness are not the same. Loneliness is emptiness without purpose. Solitude is fullness without distraction. One drains you, the other refines you. That's why isolation destroys some and empowers others. It breaks those who depend on the world to feel whole, and it builds those who find wholeness within. The chosen emerge from it like forged steel, silent, focused, unshakable. They no longer need the world's noise to validate their worth. They've heard something louder, the voice of truth within. Most people never survive this phase because they can't sit still long enough to meet their soul. But the ones who do, they come out transformed, calm, disciplined, clear. They've learned that solitude isn't the absence of love. It's the presence of God, because awakening isn't about finding people who understand you. It's about becoming someone who no longer needs to be understood, and that level of peace only isolation can teach. 4. Because the ego fights back harder than the devil. When most people think of evil, they imagine an enemy outside of themselves, something dark, foreign, waiting in the shadows. But when you awaken, you discover the most dangerous enemy has been inside you all along. The ego, the false self, the invisible master pulling your strings since the day you were born. The ego is clever. It doesn't wear horns. It wears your voice. It speaks in your thoughts, your fears, your desires. It tells you who you are, what to defend, what to fear, and who to blame. It builds your identity, not out of truth, but out of survival. And when you begin to awaken, that identity starts to crack. That's when the ego fights back harder than anything else in existence. It resists change because awakening threatens its existence. To awaken is to see through illusion, and the ego is illusion. The moment you start realizing that you are not your thoughts, not your reputation, not your history, the ego begins to panic. It will do anything to keep control. It will manipulate your emotions, distort your perception, and convince you that you're losing your mind. That's why the battle of awakening feels like madness. One part of you wants freedom, the other clings to control. One part seeks truth, the other defends illusion. The ego doesn't die quietly, it creates chaos to survive. It feeds on comparison, jealousy, judgment, and pride. It whispers that you are special one moment and worthless the next. Anything to keep you chasing validation instead of liberation. This inner war is what breaks most people. They can't tell which voice is real. They confuse the ego's screams for intuition. They mistake its fear for wisdom. The ego doesn't care whether you succeed or fail, as long as you remain attached to something. Approval, power, status, identity. It feeds on attachment, because as long as you cling to form, the ego lives. When you awaken, you start noticing how deep its roots go, how even your good deeds were often ego-driven, how even your spirituality can become another disguise, a way to feel superior rather than surrendered. The ego will even wear holiness as a mask if it keeps you safe from humility. It's not the devil outside you that derails your awakening. It's the ego inside you pretending to be divine. Few people win that war because they try to kill the ego instead of understanding it. But the ego isn't something to destroy. It's something to transcend. You can't fight it with hate. That only strengthens it. The more you resist it, the more it hides behind your resistance. The key is awareness, quiet observation, seeing it without reacting, without judgment, without fear. That awareness is what dissolves its grip. Every time you observe a thought instead of obeying it, the ego loses ground. Every time you let go of control, the ego weakens. Every time you choose humility over pride, silence over argument, peace over reaction, you reclaim your power from it. But make no mistake, it will not surrender easily. The ego has lived in you for years, ruling your choices, shaping your identity. It will create false crises just to reassert itself. It will whisper, "You're losing yourself," when in truth, you're losing it. It will disguise itself as logic, as intuition, even as divine inspiration. That's how subtle it is. Only the truly awake see the difference. They've fought that silent war long enough to recognize the enemy's voice. They know that real awakening isn't conquering the world, it's conquering the self. And when the ego finally breaks, something extraordinary happens. Peace. Not the peace of victory, but the peace of surrender. You realize there was never a devil outside, only one within. And that enemy was never evil. It was afraid. Afraid to die. Afraid to let go. Afraid to dissolve into the truth of what you've always been. Pure consciousness. Few win that inner war because few are willing to lose everything false to find everything real. But the chosen, they don't fight the ego forever. They outgrow it. They stop feeding it with attention, and it starves into silence. That's the moment of true awakening. Not when you defeat your ego, but when you no longer believe its voice. 5. Because light forces you to face your darkness. The final stage of awakening is not light, it's exposure. The brighter your awareness becomes, the more it illuminates what hides within you. Every shadow, every suppressed emotion, every buried wound that once slept quietly under layers of distraction begins to awaken too. And when it does, it doesn't whisper. It roars. This is the part of awakening that no one talks about. The stage where the light you prayed for begins to burn. The truth you asked for becomes unbearable. Because when real light enters you, it doesn't just reveal beauty, it exposes everything unhealed. It forces you to confront the anger, the jealousy, the fear, the guilt, the shame you thought you had transcended. Most people can't handle this. They thought awakening meant escaping their darkness, not meeting it. They imagined enlightenment as floating above their pain, not walking through it. But light, by its nature, reveals what's hidden. You can't rise without seeing the weight you've been carrying. You can't ascend without confronting the shadows you've cast. When the light of awareness shines inside you, it shows you things you never wanted to see. The masks you wear, the lies you told yourself, the ways you've hurt others and yourself. It shows you how much of your goodness was performance, how much of your kindness came from fear, how much of your faith came from insecurity. It's humbling, even horrifying. And that's where most people break, because it's easier to judge the darkness of the world than to face the darkness within. The ego fights back, whispering, "This isn't who you are," when in truth, it's exactly what needs to be seen. The chosen, however, understand the purpose of this confrontation. They don't run. They let the light reveal it all. They stare into the mirror of the soul without flinching, because they know the shadow isn't evil, it's just unhealed. The parts of you that you've rejected are still part of you. To awaken is to reclaim them, not deny them. Integration is the real enlightenment. Anyone can love their light. Only the strong can love their darkness. The chosen realize that the path to heaven runs through hell, and that both exist within. The demons you face during awakening aren't external beings. They're the unhealed versions of you, begging for acknowledgement. You can't destroy them through denial. You heal them through acceptance. You embrace them with awareness until they lose their power. You stop fighting your fear, and you understand it. You stop hating your anger, and you listen to it. You stop avoiding your pain, and you transform it into wisdom. That's how light becomes power, not by escaping the dark, but by illuminating it. The shadow is not your enemy, it's your teacher. It holds every piece of truth you were too afraid to face. When you integrate it, you become whole. When you reject it, you remain divided, forever battling yourself. That's why most people never reach full awakening. They make it to the light, but they don't survive the reflection. They crumble when they realize enlightenment isn't about perfection. It's about honesty. It's not about rising above the world. It's about embracing everything within you, even the parts you swore you'd never show. But the chosen, they walk straight into their darkness. They know that true mastery isn't light without shadow. It's light that understands shadow. Their peace doesn't come from purity. It comes from integration. They stop labeling parts of themselves as good or bad. They simply become aware. And awareness transforms everything. The darkness doesn't disappear. It becomes depth. The pain doesn't vanish. It becomes purpose. The chaos doesn't stop. It becomes clarity. The awakened don't fear their shadows anymore. They walk with them, because they've realized that the same darkness that once haunted them now guards their wisdom. The same fire that once burned them now fuels their light. To awaken is to see everything, the holy and the human, the light and the shadow, and still choose love. That's why light breaks most people, because it doesn't just show them what's divine, it shows them what's real. And only those who can love themselves after seeing everything survive the awakening. Most people never survive their spiritual awakening, not because they are weak, but because they were never taught what awakening truly is. It's not peace. It's not perfection. It's death, destruction, silence, and surrender. It's the unmaking of everything false within you so that only truth remains. Awakening strips away your illusions, your comforts, your attachments, and forces you to face the only enemy that ever existed, yourself. It isolates you. It exposes you. It burns everything you thought was you, until you stand naked before creation, humbled and awake. That's why most turn back. They want the light, but not the fire. They want growth, but not change. They want freedom, but not truth. But the chosen, they endure. They walk through the fire willingly, knowing that destruction is the price of rebirth. They die before they die, and in that death, they discover something eternal, peace. Because awakening was never about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who you've always been, beneath the lies, beneath the fear, beneath the noise. And when you finally remember, nothing can break you again. Subscribe to join the Guru Clan, a brotherhood of awakened souls walking through fire, mastering solitude and rising through truth. Comment below. What part of your awakening tested you the most? Your story might help another soul survive theirs. Remember this, Guru Clan. The light won't save you from the darkness. It will reveal it. But if you dare to face it, the darkness becomes your crown.